He froze. The rifle slipped from his hands and hit the ground with a dull thud that cut through the training field's noise. The young soldier's eyes widened, not from fear, but recognition, because the old man standing at the edge of the field, watching in silence, had just whispered his name. A name the soldier hadn't heard spoken like that since he was a child. A name that carried a history buried deeper than any uniform or medal could reveal. No one else noticed. The drill went on, boots striking rhythm, orders echoing through the air. But for those few seconds, time folded in on itself, and the past stood face to face with the present. The old veteran didn't move. He simply stared at the young man, eyes filled with something heavier than pride, softer than sorrow. He'd waited decades for that moment, not to salute, not to correct, but to make peace with a ghost that wore his own name. And when he finally spoke again, every sound on that field seemed to fade away. "Your father," he said quietly, "saved my life." Fort Branson, Texas, a base known more for its heat than its history. Private Ethan Cole had been there just 6 weeks, one of the new recruits trying to earn his first stripe and prove he belonged among men twice his experience. The morning started before sunrise, boots lined up in the dust, the air thick with caffeine and commands. For Ethan, the rhythm was both punishment and salvation, a chance to escape the kind of silence that followed him home from every deployment of his father's generation. Ethan's father, Captain Mark Cole, had been a name whispered in old stories, the kind veterans spoke of with lowered voices and half smiles. A soldier who never came back, not officially listed among the fallen, but gone all the same. Ethan grew up with medals instead of memories, and questions instead of closure. His mother said his father was a good man who made hard choices. That was all she ever gave him. On that morning, the heat shimmered off the training field as the platoon lined up for the endurance course. Their instructor, Sergeant Rains, was the kind who could turn a whisper into a command. The recruits were halfway through when Ethan noticed someone standing near the fence. An older man in civilian clothes, posture straight despite the years. The man didn't move, didn't call out, just watched. When Ethan dropped his rifle later that afternoon, it wasn't because he stumbled or slipped. It was because the man by the fence had spoken his name, softly, like someone recalling a prayer. The recruits laughed under their breath, but the old man didn't flinch. He stepped forward only once the field was silent, and the wind caught his words like they'd been waiting decades to be heard. "Your father saved my life," he said again, "and I think you deserve to know how." That was how it began, not with a salute, not with a ceremony, but with a story carried by someone who had seen the best and worst of what loyalty could cost. And for Ethan Cole, that afternoon marked the day he stopped being just a soldier and started becoming his father's unfinished story. The day's training ended with bodies slumped on benches and boots shedding dust like tired lungs. Sergeant Rains dismissed the platoon with a nod sharp enough to cut wire. Ethan stayed behind, pretending to wipe down his rifle, eyes flicking to the figure by the chain link. The old man hadn't moved. He stood with the patience of a lighthouse, as if the tide would eventually bring what he'd been waiting for. Ethan walked over, pulse steadying in that strange way it did before hard conversations. Up close, the veteran's age showed in careful details. Sun-creased skin, knuckles nicked by old work, a posture that said he'd learned to carry weight without complaining. He wore no hat, no unit shirt, just a plain jacket and a silver bracelet scratched by time. "You knew my father?" Ethan asked. The old man nodded once. "Name's Walter Hayes," he said. "Most people called me Walt. Your father called me Coach, because I wouldn't stop correcting his field knots." A small smile touched his mouth and was gone. Mark Cole was the best kind of stubborn, the kind that keeps people alive. Ethan swallowed. People say things. They don't say much. They don't because some stories got buried under paperwork. Walt tapped the fence with a finger. But truth doesn't stay buried forever. Sometimes it walks onto a field and drops a rifle. Ethan bristled, then let it go. "What happened to him?" Walt reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photograph, the edges soft from years of pockets and rain. 4 men stood in front of a beat-up truck, helmets crooked, grins lopsided. On the back, written in marker, Team July, Ridge 14. Walt's finger landed on the man at the far right. Younger than Ethan expected, eyes bright but serious, a hand on someone else's shoulder like a promise. That was the week everything tilted, Walt said. Ridge 14. 2 valleys over from a line on the map folks pretended was just a line. Your dad wasn't in charge that day. He took responsibility anyway. Ridge 14, Ethan repeated, tasting the shape of it. He'd never heard the term at home. His mother had kept the past in a locked drawer. Where? Far enough that mail took 3 tries to find us, Walt said. Close enough that the wind carried conversations you never wanted to hear. Our team was running a link-up with a local patrol. Routine on paper. Nothing's routine where the ground slopes away beneath your feet. He paused, searching Ethan's face for permission to go on. Ethan nodded. The plan was simple, Walt continued. Cross a dry creek bed, meet at a broken wall, exchange supplies, head back before the heat turned mean. Halfway there, we realized the creek wasn't dry. It was quiet. Too quiet. Your father stopped, raised a hand, and we froze. He'd noticed the grass at the edges was flattened in the wrong direction. Not water. Boots. A breeze rattled the fence. Trainees joked in the distance, unaware that a different kind of drill was unfolding at the edge of the field. Mark changed routes on the spot, Walt said. He cut a crescent around the creek, kept us in the shadow of those low hills. 10 minutes later, Walt's voice thinned, then steadied. Let's just say the original path wouldn't have been kind. We found where someone had buried gifts no one wanted. Wires, triggers, enough to turn a routine morning into a long list of names on a wall. Ethan's grip tightened on the fence. So he just saw it. Pattern recognition mixed with instinct, Walt replied. He noticed small lies the ground tells when it's been messed with. That's what kept us from taking losses that day. Ethan studied the photo again, his father's hand on a shoulder. The easy balance in his stance. A man who belonged to a place and to people. We still had to make the link up, Walt said. Your dad took point, but he didn't make it heroic. He made it precise. No speeches. Just hand signals and pace counting and the kind of calm that makes everyone else breathe. We reached the broken wall late. Our local partners never showed. Later we learned they'd been delayed by a roadblock, the kind that appears when rumors travel faster than radios. On the way back, the sun went down too quickly. Shadows got long, distances got tricky. And, Ethan asked, the word barely a sound. We walked into a crosswind that carried a smell like burned plastic, Walt said. Mark stopped us again. He didn't like the way the hillside looked. Smooth where it should have been messy, disturbed where goats usually chewed it to threads. He angled us to a saddle further west. The team grumbled, he didn't budge. Ethan heard the unsaid line. What was on the original route? Enough to teach hard lessons, Walt said. We found the scorch marks later. We also found tracks, not ours. Someone was waiting to count us as a headline, the kind that starts with numbers. For a moment they stood in the shade of the fence like it was church. Walt finally tucked the photo away and met Ethan's eyes. You asked what happened to him, he said. Truth is, that question has more than one answer. Some days a person is taken by a single moment. Other days they're carried off by 100 decisions no one writes down. Your father didn't vanish because he was careless. He stepped into storm so others could walk home dry. Ethan's jaw tightened. Did he walk home? Walt studied the horizon. Not that night, but there's more to the story than endings. There's what he left behind. There's what he did before the part everyone fixates on. He lifted the bracelet showing the inside. 2 initials were engraved there. MC. He pulled me out from under a collapsed wall during a dust-up nobody predicted, Walt said softly. If not for Mark Cole, my grandson would never have known my name. Ethan exhaled slow. The training field felt different now, as if it knew it had been drafted into a confession. "Why tell me today?" he asked. Walt's smile returned, faint but real. "Because you picked up your rifle the way he used to, left hand tightening first like you were counting the future. And because the past never liked being ignored." He tapped the fence once more. "If you want the rest, meet me tomorrow morning. There's a coffee shop outside the gate that still believes in refills." Ethan nodded. He didn't trust his voice. The veteran turned to go, then paused. "Bring the photo to your mother," Walt added. "She'll recognize the handwriting on the back." Walt walked away, steady as a metronome. Ethan stood there, the weight of a name resting on his shoulders, heavier than any pack. He picked up his rifle, and for the first time since arriving, it felt less like equipment and more like a question waiting for an answer. The next morning, the air outside Fort Branson smelled of rain that never came. Ethan walked through the base gate in civilian clothes, a strange freedom in his stride, the photograph folded in his pocket. He found the coffee shop exactly where Walt had said, a squat brick building with a flickering open sign and the kind of quiet that seemed older than the town itself. Walt was already there, seated by the window, hands around a steaming mug he hadn't touched. His jacket was the same, his bracelet gleaming faintly in the low light. When Ethan stepped in, the old man looked up and nodded once, the gesture of someone who'd kept his word 1,000 times before. "Sit," Walt said. "You look like your father did after a 20-mile march and pretending the weight didn't matter." Ethan half smiled, took the seat opposite. "I brought the photo. You said my mom would know the handwriting." "She will," Walt said, eyes not leaving him. "But before you hand it to her, you should understand the story behind it. Otherwise, all you'll see is ink." The waitress brought coffee, and for a while they sat in silence that was almost comfortable. Then Walt reached into a leather folder and unfolded an old topographic map. Lines, elevations, grid numbers. The ink had faded, but the creases told of years folded in pockets, maybe in jungles or deserts. "That ridge," Walt said, pointing to a mark near the center, "wasn't on the standard patrol route. It was a blind spot. No radio relay, no backup. We were sent to make contact with a recon team that had gone dark. They were good men, smart, careful. But sometimes being careful doesn't mean you're safe." Ethan leaned closer. "You were both there?" "I was. Your father volunteered to go after them. It wasn't his mission, but he knew their commanding officer. Said he couldn't let a friend go missing without a trace. Command said fine, but no reinforcements, no air support. We went in at dusk. 3 men, 1 rule. Silence until sunrise." Walt's voice had a rhythm to it, like he'd told the story before, but only to himself. "We found the first signal flare half buried in the mud," he said. "No bodies, no equipment, just that flare. Your father picked it up, turned it over, and said one thing. They didn't light it. Someone wanted us to find it. But that's when I realized he was thinking 3 steps ahead." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Did you find the missing team?" "We found what was left of their post," Walt said. "Empty, silent. You could smell the cordite, even after the rain. There was a radio, smashed but still humming faintly. Your father fixed it using parts from his own gear. He got a signal through long enough to send coordinates, but the line went dead before we got a reply." He sipped his coffee finally, grimacing as if tasting memories instead of bitterness. "Then came the flash," Walt said. "Not close, but close enough. It came from the ridge itself. A lens glint, maybe a scope. He pushed me down before I even processed it. The first round hit the tree behind us. The second never came. Mark had already moved uphill, drawing their attention away. He didn't yell, didn't call for backup. Just moved like a shadow." Ethan felt the hairs rise on his arms. "He went alone?" "He went forward," Walt said. "There's a difference. He signaled me to circle wide to wait for his mark. But the mark never came. I heard 3 sharp cracks, then nothing but the wind." Ethan swallowed hard. "And that was the last time you saw him?" "Not quite. Walt reached again into the folder and pulled out a torn field note. This was found 2 days later when recovery teams finally arrived. It's your father's handwriting. Ethan took the paper carefully. The edges were burned, but the words were legible. If you find this, keep heading east. There's one alive. Don't stop. Ethan stared at it, jaw tight. Who was alive? Walt's eyes softened. Me. He meant me. The words hung between them like the dust motes caught in sunlight. Ethan tried to breathe evenly, but his chest felt like someone had filled it with gravel. You were the one he saved, Ethan said quietly. I was, Walt replied. But it's not guilt I've been carrying all these years. It's the promise I made him before he disappeared into that ridge. I told him, if I ever met his family, I'd tell them he wasn't just a soldier lost in the field. He was a man who saw the world as something worth protecting, even when the world stopped protecting him. Ethan folded the note carefully, hands trembling. So he never came back. Walt shook his head. No body, no report, just a silence that got filed away as closure. He leaned back. But I never believed in silence. Sometimes the world hides things not to forget, but to wait for the right person to listen. Ethan met his gaze. And that person's me? You're the only one who carries his name and still asks questions, Walt said. That counts for something. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows, stirring dust and memory alike. Ethan stared at the map one more time. Then let's go, he said. Show me where it happened. Walt smiled, not in surprise, but in recognition. That's exactly what your father said. The road to Ridge 14 wasn't marked on any GPS. Walt's truck rattled over gravel like it was chewing time itself. Ethan sat beside him, the folded map between them, watching mesquite trees give way to the hard rise of scrub-covered hills. The deeper they went, the more it felt like the world was pulling them backward, into something that hadn't finished happening. Your father said the ridge was a lesson, Walt murmured, keeping his eyes on the road. Not in tactics, in silence. What kind of lesson? Ethan asked. That some truths aren't buried by time, Walt said. They're buried by people who can't face them. They reached a clearing just past noon. The air shimmered with heat. Cicadas screamed from the brush like distant static. The ridge rose ahead, a long scar of red stone and shale. Ethan climbed out, feeling the weight of the map in his pocket, the photo still tucked inside his jacket. Here? He asked. Here, Walt said, stepping forward slowly, like a man visiting a grave without a headstone. They began to climb, following faint outlines of what might once have been a path. Walt walked with care, his boots testing the ground as if it could still lie to him. Ethan followed close behind, noting the small markers. A twisted bit of wire, a rusted buckle, a piece of spent brass half swallowed by the dirt. At the top, the ridge leveled into a plateau overlooking a dry valley. Walt stopped and pointed toward a cluster of rocks blackened by age and sun. That's where it happened, he said quietly. Where your father made the call. Ethan crouched, running his hand over the stones. The heat bit his palm. You said he went forward, toward the flash. Walt nodded. I followed 20 minutes later when it was quiet. Found signs of movement, drag marks, footprints leading downhill. And this. He pulled from his pocket a small flattened bullet casing attached to a string. He used to wear it as a charm, said it reminded him that luck and training were two different gods. Ethan turned it over, tracing the edge. You've kept it all this time? I've kept the promise that came with it, Walt said. He told me if something happened, to make sure his family knew he didn't die chasing orders. He died protecting men who would never know his name. Ethan stood and looked around. The valley spread out before him. Endless, harsh, indifferent. Did you ever find out who ambushed you? Walt hesitated. That's the thing. We never confirmed an ambush. Officially, command said it was a misfire from friendly ordnance. But anyone who smelled the difference between diesel smoke and detonation knows better. Someone wanted that recon team gone, and anyone who went looking for them too. Ethan frowned. Why cover it up? Because sometimes the truth stains the wrong uniform, Walt said. His tone wasn't bitter, just factual. The report said mechanical error. I called it what it was: betrayal. They walked farther along the ridge until they reached a shallow depression near the rocks. The ground was softer there, disturbed once, long ago. Walt knelt and brushed at the dirt. Beneath it, a fragment of metal caught the light, a piece of dog tag, half buried, the engraving nearly erased by time. Ethan knelt beside him, breath caught. The visible letters were just enough: CO and the faint curve of an L. His hands shook. It's him, he whispered. Walt nodded slowly. I left it there years ago. Didn't have the heart to dig deeper. Some things you let the earth hold for a while. Ethan closed his hand around the tag fragment, feeling its warmth. He was right here. Yeah, Walt said, but that's not where his story ends. After the blast, we found blood trails. 2 sets. One led east, one south. The med team followed the southern one. I followed the east. Theirs ended in nothing. Mine ended in footprints heading toward the canyon. Bare footprints. Ethan looked up sharply. Bare. Bare, Walt repeated. No boots, no gear, just prints in the dust. I thought I was hallucinating. But I followed them until the sun dropped, found a burned-out campfire and a message scratched into a rock. He pulled a photograph from his folder. Grainy, taken decades ago. The rock bore one line, carved deep despite the wear. Tell them I kept the promise. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. What promise? Walt's gaze turned distant. That's what I'm still trying to figure out. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred, carrying the smell of dry grass and something metallic, like the ghost of machinery, long silent. Ethan broke the silence first. If he made it that far, maybe he survived. Walt didn't answer immediately. Maybe, he said finally. Or maybe he became part of the place, the kind of story soldiers tell to remind themselves that not all ghosts wear chains. Ethan looked down at the fragment again. Then we find the rest, he said. All of it. Walt smiled faintly. That's exactly what your father said before he went over that ridge. They stood there until the sun dipped low, throwing long shadows that reached like memories down into the valley. A valley that still kept its secrets, waiting for someone with the same name to come asking again. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The air inside the barracks was heavy, humming faintly with the sound of ceiling fans that never quite reached the corners. He lay awake, the fragment of his father's dog tag in his hand, the engraved letters pressing faintly into his skin. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ridge, that scar of red earth, the carved message on the stone. Tell them I kept the promise. By dawn, he'd made up his mind. If his father's story had been buried, he'd dig it up, even if the shovels were made of paperwork. After morning drills, Ethan went to the base's records office, a dull, windowless room that smelled of dust and old toner. Rows of cabinets lined the walls, guarded by a sergeant who looked like he hadn't blinked since the Cold War. I'm looking for mission archives, Ethan said carefully. Year 1993. Operation Ridgeline. I think it might be under the 14th Recon Division. The sergeant narrowed his eyes. Purpose? Research? Ethan said quickly. My father served. I'm just trying to trace his assignments. The sergeant's jaw tightened, but after a moment, he disappeared into the stacks. Ethan waited. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to measure his patience in decibels. When the man returned, he carried a slim file, too slim for what should have been a full operational log. He set it down with a dull thump. That's all we've got, he said flatly. Ethan flipped it open. Inside were only 4 pages. 2 were inventory checklists. 1 was a terrain sketch. The last page, a casualty summary, was almost entirely redacted. Thick black lines swallowed names, coordinates, and command notes. But one word at the bottom remained untouched. Unresolved. Ethan frowned. That's it? The sergeant shrugged. If it's not here, it's not meant to be. Ethan slipped a folded copy of the terrain map into his pocket and left before the man could ask questions. Outside, the Texas sun was brutal, the kind that bleached color from everything it touched. He found Walt waiting by his truck, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Find what you were looking for? Walt asked. Not even close, Ethan said. They've erased almost everything. It's like Ridge 14 never existed. Walt nodded slowly. That tracks. What do you mean? Walt took a deep breath. After the mission, Command shut it all down. The ridge was labeled a restricted zone. No reports, no follow-ups. I was ordered to stop asking questions. They said it was for national security. You know what that usually means? Ethan's jaw tightened. Someone screwed up. Or someone covered up, Walt replied. Big difference. They drove out of the base and parked near the old diner on the edge of town. Walt pulled a manila envelope from the glove compartment. Inside were copies of handwritten letters, faded and water-stained. I kept these off the record, Walt said. Copies of what your father sent me before he disappeared. The originals were confiscated. Ethan unfolded one carefully. The handwriting was bold, deliberate, the kind of script that didn't waste motion. The date was 2 days before Ridge 14. Something feels wrong with this assignment. Coordinates don't match the briefing map. I've seen similar patterns before. Intel loops that lead men into traps. If this goes bad, Walt, promise me one thing. Don't trust the report. Ethan's pulse kicked. He knew. Yeah, Walt said quietly. He always knew when something smelled off. The man could read lies the way others read weather. Ethan studied the second letter. This one was shorter, almost rushed. Tell Anna I might be late. Don't tell her why. There's a reason they sent us without a radio relay. I'll explain when I get back. He read the line again. There's a reason they sent us without a radio relay. That's not a mistake, Ethan said. That's a setup. Walt looked at him steadily. You're starting to sound like him. Ethan leaned back, eyes narrowing. You said earlier, truth doesn't stay buried forever. What if someone in command made sure it stayed that way? Then we're kicking a hornet's nest that's been quiet for 30 years, Walt said. And hornets don't forget who threw the rock. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of old neon outside the diner window filling the space between them. Ethan finally spoke. I'm not walking away. If my father risked his life for the truth, then the least I can do is finish what he started. Walt smiled faintly. You really are his son. He reached into the envelope again and slid one final item across the table, a photo of a group of officers standing beside a command tent. Ethan's father wasn't in it, but one of the men was familiar. Who's that? Ethan asked. Walt's eyes darkened. That's Colonel Harker. He signed off on Ridge 14. He's retired now, but last I heard, he consults out of Austin. Ethan studied the man's face in the photo. Clean uniform, confident smirk, eyes like polished steel. Then he's the next person we talk to. Walt gave a slow nod. You sure you're ready for the kind of answers he might give? Ethan looked out the window where the horizon shimmered under the noon sun like a mirage that refused to fade. I don't want easy answers, he said. I want the truth, the one my father never got to finish telling. Austin looked nothing like the cities Ethan knew from base rotations. It had the calm veneer of order, glass towers, clean streets, quiet cafes, but underneath, he could feel something pulsing, like the hum of old secrets wrapped in polished stone. Walt drove in silence, the truck's engine growling through traffic that moved too perfectly, too synchronized. They found Colonel Harker's address listed on a veteran's registry. Retired, consultant, suburban home on the north side. The kind of place that said comfortable conscience more than combat guilt. The lawn was trimmed, the flag freshly laundered, but something about the house felt staged. Walt cut the engine. You let me do the talking, he said. Ethan nodded, though his pulse said otherwise. They walked up the driveway. Walt knocked twice. Firm, precise. A moment later, the door opened. Harker stood there. Older, heavier, but unmistakably the man from the photo. His hair was silver, cut short. His eyes, sharp as glass, flicked from Walt to Ethan. "Walt Hayes," he said, voice smooth but cautious. "Didn't expect you." "Most ghosts don't announce their visit," Walt replied. "You've got a minute?" Harker looked at Ethan again. "This your boy?" "No," Walt said. "He's Mark Coles." That name stopped the air. Harker's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. A flicker, fast and involuntary. "Coles?" he repeated. "Didn't think I'd hear that name again." Ethan stepped forward. "I think it's time someone did." Harker's jaw shifted. "You'd better come inside." The house smelled of old books and leather polish. The living room was arranged like a museum, medals framed on the wall, a folded flag in glass, photos from bases around the world. Everything spotless. Everything curated. "Coffee?" Harker asked. "No," Walt said. "We came for answers." The colonel sat, exhaling like a man already tired of the game. "You're 30 years too late, son. Whatever you think you're digging for—" "I'm not digging," Ethan cut in. "I'm reclaiming what someone buried." That earned him a small, dangerous smile. "You've got his fire. Mark was the same, always thought rules were suggestions." "Rules didn't kill him?" Ethan said. "Someone did." The silence that followed was long enough to measure in heartbeats. Harker leaned back, fingers steepled. "You think I pulled the trigger?" "I think you signed the paper that sent him there without backup," Walt said. "No radio relay, no medevac, wrong coordinates. Everything about Ridge 14 screams setup." Harker's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone, Sergeant." "I've been watching my tone for 3 decades, Walt said coldly. "All it got me was nightmares." Harker sighed and rose, walking to a cabinet. He pulled out a thin folder and dropped it onto the table between them. "This is what's left of Ridge 14, he said. "You want to know why your father went in blind? Because command didn't trust the local intel network anymore. We'd had leaks. Half our safe routes were compromised. Mark volunteered to test a new one. He knew the risk." "That's the sanitized version," Ethan said. "Try again." Harker's face tightened. "You're not authorized to see." "Authorization died with him," Ethan snapped. For the first time, Harker's mask slipped. He looked at Ethan, really looked, and something softened, just a fraction. "You think I don't remember that day? I lost 6 men and one of the best officers I ever had. You don't carry that lightly." "Then why hide it?" Walt pressed. "Why redact everything? Why let his son grow up thinking his father vanished for nothing?" Harker turned toward the window, staring out at the street. "Because it wasn't supposed to happen. Ridge 14 wasn't a mission. It was an extraction. And someone else got there first." Ethan frowned. "Extraction of what?" "Not what," Harker said quietly. "Who?" He walked back to the table and slid a photograph across it. Grainy, nighttime surveillance, 3 figures crossing a ridge under infrared. One was clearly Mark Cole. Another was Walt. The third was someone smaller, wearing no uniform. "Who is that?" Ethan asked. "A local interpreter," Harker said. "At least that's what we were told. But after the operation, Intel flagged her as an informant for both sides. Your father found out. He wasn't supposed to." Walt's face went still. "He tried to protect her?" "He tried to get her out," Harker said. "He broke orders to do it. When the ridge blew, she was with him. We assumed both were gone. But days later, we got a transmission, encrypted. Only 2 words decoded clearly." Ethan leaned forward. "What words?" Harker hesitated, then whispered them like they were a curse. "Promise kept." Ethan froze, the message carved into the rock, the same words. He looked at Walt, who looked back at him with the expression of a man realizing a puzzle he'd spent half his life building just changed shape. "You got that transmission?" Walt said. "And you never sent a team?" "Command refused," Harker said. "Said it was too late. I filed an appeal. It vanished. After that, I was transferred." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "You buried the truth." "I survived the politics," Harker said quietly. "But I didn't forget. And if you're smart, you'll stop now. Whoever controlled that op is still out there, older, richer, and allergic to questions." Walt stood. "We're done being quiet." Harker gave him a long look. "Then you'd better find her. The interpreter. If she's alive, she's the only one who knows what really happened." Ethan pocketed the photo. "Where do we start?" Harker hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small rusted dog tag chain, broken in half. "Your father gave her this. Said if anything went wrong, she should find the other half." Ethan stared. It matched the fragment in his own pocket. Perfectly. Walt's breath caught. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like the trail just woke up." They left Austin before sunrise. The highway stretched east like a scar, the sky barely beginning to bruise with color. Walt drove in silence, his knuckles pale against the steering wheel. Ethan sat beside him, the broken dog tag in his hand, turning it over again and again like a coin that decided lives. "She had this," Ethan said, holding it up. "My father gave it to her." "Why?" Walt didn't look away from the road. "Because he trusted her more than the men giving orders. Trust got him killed," Ethan said bitterly. Walt shook his head. "No, trust saved her. Maybe that's the part you're not seeing yet." They reached the outskirts of San Marcos by noon, a place where the highway met forgotten rail lines and warehouses half swallowed by dust. According to Harker's old contact log, a woman matching the interpreter's description had been granted asylum under a different name 20 years earlier. No one had seen her since. They parked near an old Veterans Outreach Center. The building looked like it was built from leftover bricks and good intentions. A faded sign read, "Project Homecoming." Inside, the air was cool, still scented with paper and disinfectant. A receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" Walt stepped forward. "We're looking for a volunteer, older woman, mid-50s, foreign accent. Might go by the name Lena Ortez." The woman frowned. "Lena, yeah. She comes by sometimes. Doesn't stay long. Leaves supplies, books for the others. She never signs anything." "Why?" "She knew someone we lost," Walt said simply. The receptionist studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the back. "There's a storage room she uses. She left a box there last week. You can check it, if you mean no harm." They thanked her and walked down the narrow hall. The room smelled of dust and faint lavender. On a small table sat a cardboard box marked only with a faded symbol, a half circle and a line through it. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside were books, letters, and an old photograph. He froze. It was his father again, younger, smiling, arm around a woman with dark hair and kind eyes. Behind them, the same ridge, the same jagged skyline of Ridge 14. Walt exhaled slowly. "That's her." Ethan ran his finger over the edge of the photo. "She wasn't just some interpreter." "No," Walt said quietly. "She was the reason he volunteered." Ethan looked up. "You knew?" "I suspected," Walt said. "There were moments in the field, glances, the kind you can't fake. She was translating more than language for him." Ethan's chest tightened. "So he risked everything for her." "He risked everything for what she represented," Walt said. "A way out. A chance to believe the job still meant something good." Ethan pulled another paper from the box, a folded map, newer than the one Walt carried. A red line traced from Ridge 14 to a small town on the border. At the bottom, a note in careful handwriting. "If anyone finds this, I kept my word. Tell them I didn't run. Ethan whispered. She's alive. Maybe, Walt said, but she's not hiding from the past. She's hiding from whoever wrote the report that buried it. A sound behind them broke the air, a door creaking. Both men turned. A woman stood in the doorway, scarf around her head, eyes sharp but kind. She looked older than the photo, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Lena Ortez, Ethan said. She studied him for a long time before answering. You have his eyes, she whispered. Walt stepped back, letting Ethan move forward. I'm Ethan Cole, he said softly. Mark's son. Lena's breath caught. Then the promise was real. She walked closer, hands trembling as she reached out and touched the dog tag fragment in his palm. He said someone would come one day, that his son would find the other half. Ethan swallowed. He made it out of the ridge, didn't he? Lena nodded, tears filling her eyes. Yes, he made it out. But not for long. Walt's voice was quiet but steady. What happened, Lena? She sank into a chair, hands clasped together. We were ambushed after the blast. He carried me through the canyon for 2 days. He wouldn't stop. Said as long as I lived, his men's names would live too. When we reached the river crossing, he told me to go ahead, that he'd draw their attention. I didn't see him again. Ethan's throat closed. And you never told anyone? I tried, she said. No one believed me. They said there was no record of a mission, no record of a man named Cole. They erased him, and I realized why. Because what he discovered before that operation would have destroyed reputations. Walt leaned in. What did he find? She looked at them, eyes suddenly sharper. That the supply routes weren't just moving gear. They were moving people, locals, translators, informants, civilians, sold off as liabilities once they outlived their use. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. And my father? He found the evidence, Lena said, and refused to look away. The room fell silent except for the hum of the old fluorescent light above them. He gave me this, she continued, pulling out a small drive sealed in plastic. Said to keep it safe until someone came asking with his name. Ethan took it carefully, the metal cold in his palm. What's on it? The files he downloaded from Command's secure network the night before Ridge 14, she said. The names, the routes, the proof. Walt looked stunned. He wasn't just trying to save her. He was trying to expose them. Lena nodded. And now if you open that drive, you'll inherit everything he was fighting against. Ethan looked down at it, this small, silent thing that had cost his father everything, and then back at her. Then it's about time someone finished what he started, he said. Lena smiled sadly. He said you would say that. They checked into a roadside motel just outside San Marcos, one of those forgotten places where the neon buzzed louder than the guests. Walt locked the door twice and drew the curtains. The air smelled like old coffee and rain-soaked carpet, the kind of smell that promised secrecy but not safety. Ethan set the small drive on the table between them, staring at it like it might detonate. You sure about this? He asked. Walt gave a small shrug. I've been sure about less. He plugged the drive into his old laptop, the same one he'd used for field briefings back when emails still came through static. The screen blinked, then filled with a directory of encrypted files. Dozens of them. Dates, coordinates, operation names that didn't appear in any public log. Ethan scrolled through. This is everything, he murmured. Every ghost mission they ever buried. Walt leaned in. Look at that folder. The one marked Phoenix. That was the code name for Ridge 14. Ethan opened it. Inside were scanned memos, intercepted transmissions, and personnel rosters. One caught his eye. Cole, M. Field reassignment denied. Proceed as decoy unit. His pulse hammered. Decoy unit? Walt swore under his breath. They sent him in as bait, to draw out whoever was running those black ops routes. He wasn't supposed to make it out alive. Ethan scrolled further. Attached to the memo was a communications log. Lines of text, Timestamps. The last entry was marked 23:48 hours. Cole. Extraction compromised. Objective secured. If this message reaches command, tell them. Promise kept. Ethan froze. He sent that himself. Walt nodded slowly. That was his last transmission. Before either of them could speak again, the motel's exterior lights flickered. Then the faint sound of tires on gravel. Walt moved to the window, lifted the curtain just enough to see two black SUVs parked under the broken sign. Company, he said. No plates, no headlights. Ethan's mind raced. How would they even know? That drive's still hot, Walt interrupted. They've been waiting for someone to plug it in. He yanked the power cord, shoved the laptop into his bag, and motioned toward the back door. Time to move. They slipped out into the narrow alley behind the motel, hearts thudding against their ribs. The night air was thick with humidity and adrenaline. Walt led them toward the drainage canal that ran parallel to the highway. Where are we going? Ethan whispered. Somewhere they won't expect us to walk, Walt said. They made it to the canal just as flashlights swept across the parking lot behind them. Voices shouted orders, crisp, practiced. Whoever they weren't amateurs. They followed the canal south for nearly a mile before ducking under an old overpass. Walt finally stopped, breathing hard but steady. He opened the bag and pulled out the drive. If they want this, it means it's still dangerous, which means it still matters. Ethan took it from him, staring at the small device. We need to get it somewhere safe. There's a journalist in Houston, Walt said, used to cover military corruption before she got chased out of D.C. If anyone can get this story out without it disappearing, it's her. Ethan nodded. Then that's where we go. They rested only long enough for the horizon to pale with dawn. When they reached Houston 12 hours later, the city buzzed like an open wire. They found the journalist and a woman named Reyes in a cramped office stacked with boxes and coffee cups. She listened without interrupting, her eyes sharp, her pen moving faster than they could speak. When Ethan placed the drive on her desk, she looked at it like it was evidence of a ghost. If this is what you say it is, she said softly, then your father didn't die in vain. I don't want him remembered as a victim, Ethan said. I want him remembered as a man who saw something wrong and did something about it. Reyes nodded. Then let's make sure the world knows. They left the city before nightfall, driving west until the skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Walt broke the silence. You know, when he whispered your name that day on the field, I realized something. Ethan glanced at him. What's that? Walt smiled faintly. The promise wasn't about him. It was about you, about making sure his story found its way home. Ethan looked down at the dog tag in his hand. Both halves now reunited, edges fitting perfectly, as if 30 years had just taken a breath and exhaled. They stopped at a rest area overlooking a stretch of desert. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of mesquite and rain. Ethan stepped out, holding the dog tag up to the setting sun. He kept his promise, he said quietly. Now it's my turn. Walt joined him, shoulders heavy but eyes lighter than they'd been in years. Then you'd better get used to the weight of truth, son. It doesn't get lighter, but it does get clearer. Behind them, the radio crackled softly with news bulletins. Somewhere in Houston, a story was breaking. One about a forgotten mission, a buried scandal, and a name the world hadn't heard in decades. Mark Cole, the man who kept his promise. A week later, the story broke nationwide. Headlines filled every major outlet. Declassified files expose hidden missions, veterans' record restored. The name that had been missing for 30 years was finally carved back into history. Captain Mark Cole. Ethan watched the coverage from a bench near the memorial grounds in Arlington. The same airfield his father had once trained on shimmered in the distance. News cameras had already moved on, but the quiet here felt heavier than applause. Sacred, like the earth itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. Beside him, Walt leaned on his cane, hat in hand. You did it, he said softly. You brought him home. Ethan shook his head. We did. He stood and walked toward the marble wall, where thousands of names shimmered under sunlight. Some fresh, some faded. His reflection blurred among them until he found it. The one that stopped time. Mark D. Cole, promise kept. Someone, probably a worker, had etched the final words at the bottom of the new plaque. Not regulation, not official, but right. Ethan traced the letters with his fingertips, and for the first time since he'd held that broken tag, he didn't feel like he was touching loss. He was touching legacy. Walt spoke from behind him. You know, he used to talk about you, not in words, but in the way he looked at things. Every mission, every risk. It was like he was making sure you'd inherit something worth believing in. Ethan turned, his voice low. He gave everything to protect the truth. It nearly cost everyone around him. Truth always costs, Walt said. That's how you know it's real. They stood in silence as a breeze passed through the memorial garden, making the flags ripple in slow unison. For a moment, Ethan swore he could hear his father's voice, the same calm tone that had once led men through chaos. It wasn't loud. It was steady. You found it, son. He closed his eyes and smiled. Walt placed a hand on his shoulder. So, what now? Ethan looked at the horizon, the same direction his father had vanished into decades ago. Now, I keep the promise alive. I tell his story. I teach others that silence isn't loyalty. Walt chuckled. Sounds like something he'd say. Ethan glanced one last time at the plaque, then slipped the dog tag, both halves joined, into the base of the memorial, under a patch of sunlight. I think he'd rather stay here, he said. They walked back toward the car, the day bright but gentle. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just the sound of boots on gravel, 2 generations of soldiers walking in rhythm again. As they reached the gate, Walt paused, turning once more toward the field of names. He dropped his rifle that day, Walt said quietly. You remember? Ethan nodded. That wasn't weakness, Walt said. That was memory recognizing itself. He heard his name because the past was calling to be finished, and you finished it. Ethan smiled faintly, eyes on the flag flapping in the wind. Then maybe the promise was never about saving anyone. Maybe it was about remembering why we fight at all. They got into the truck and drove off, the memorial fading behind them. But the name, the story, and the whisper stayed. Promise kept. The story of Captain Mark Cole isn't just about war. It's about what survives after it. Names fade, files vanish, but promises have a way of echoing through time until someone finally answers them. Ethan didn't grow up with stories of his father's heroism. He grew up with silence, the kind that buries truth and pain in the same grave. But sometimes silence breaks in its own way. A word whispered on a training field, a name that refuses to disappear. And when that happened, everything changed. It wasn't medals or headlines that restored Captain Cole's legacy. It was his son's refusal to look away, his willingness to walk back into the same dust, the same fear, the same unanswered questions, just to prove that honor doesn't die when men do. Some stories end with gunfire. This one ended with understanding. A young soldier found not just his father's name but his purpose, to carry that same code forward. Truth before comfort, loyalty before silence. Walt Hayes returned to Fort Branson weeks later. He watched new recruits train under the same sun, the same wind cutting through the field. When one of them dropped his rifle, he didn't shout. He smiled, because he knew what could begin with that sound. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the places memory meets peace, maybe Mark Cole finally rested. Because a promise kept doesn't need to be spoken again. It just needs to be remembered. If you made it this far, tell us where you're watching from. Your city, your state, your country. Every story connects through someone who listens. And if you believe that truth still matters, share this one. Because sometimes, the world only remembers when someone chooses to.